Well, it's so good to be with you in spirit. I'm in isolation, and I just so well done to everyone who's taking the strain for me. It's not so much a problem for me, it's a problem for everyone else, isn't it? And we're looking at this subject of calling. It's an amazing subject. Last week we were looking at Ruth and Boaz. Boaz, the man who sees abundance. Ruth, who shows God's faithful kindness, his chesed. Naomi, who's this poor shut away believer who just opens the door a crack and God comes rushing in and gives her so much more than she could ever have hoped for. It's a church, it's all these people, they know God. And Paul talks about knowing God, being the church, being the people of God. In most of his letters, so much of it is about that, but that's not all that Paul talks about in his letters to the churches. It's not all that being church, being a Christian is about. And we cut today to this moment. I had this vision as I was preparing for the sermon of this small young man, sort of 14, 15-year-old young man. And he's running. And he's got his stone, one stone. And he's running at Goliath. And he looses that stone and it hits Goliath, the one point of great weakness, right in the forehead. And it's all over in 1 minute. One boy, one stone, 1 minute, and it's all over. And we just think, how could David do that? And to answer that question, we have to wind back. We have to wind back to when David first sees Goliath. He sees Goliath, doesn't he? And then significantly, he hears Goliath's taunts. And his heart, his immediate reaction is, who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God? David just sees it so differently. He sees it differently to every single other person in that army. How did he do that? Well, we have to wind back the cameras to a few years before that, don't we? To when Samuel first anoints David. And it says of that moment, it says when God encounters Saul, it says that it's almost like he possesses Saul. The word uses possession. It implies there's a bit of resistance on Saul's part. But it says of David that the Holy Spirit comes on David in power. It's almost like this small boy who's anointed as king is fully cooperative with all God's desires for him. And that, my friends, is a vision of the church. That is who the church is called to be right from the earliest days when Jesus is in the wilderness. What's Jesus doing? He's building the church. How's he doing it? By showing people what God looks like. By showing them in works of great power what the goodness of God actually looks like, and by telling everyone. And then he gets his disciples to do the same, to tell everyone how good God is and to show them. And when, of course, the Holy Spirit comes in power on this gaggle of frightened men and women at the beginning of Acts, all they know how to do. What's the church about? Well, it's the church that shows everyone how powerful God is, who in acts of great power, miracles, healings, deliverances, and it tells them how good God is. It's a church that tells everyone that God's kingdom is here and shows them what that kingdom actually looks like on earth. And every Goliath that church confronts falls crashing to the ground. The Goliaths of sickness and disease. So often sickness and disease is just healed by handkerchiefs, by prayers, by touch, by Paul lying on that young man who had died, doesn't it? Just death, everything flees. And then there's the fear. There's the demonic forces of power in the heavenly places flee before the church. Within 300 years, the empire of Rome has converted to Christianity, and all because of this army that's described in the book of Acts. It's an army of businessmen, of traders, of slaves, of jail guards, of beggars, of officials, of doctors, of philosophers, of Pharisees, who are happy to give it all away because they've seen the power of God and they want to show everyone what it looks like. They are living testimonies to Jesus' character. They are the church of the impossible. There's a lovely story Ian Andrews tells of when he first went to Bill Johnson's church. Ian Andrews is he's got an amazing healing ministry, and he's an English guy. And he says that he was convicted by Bill Johnson when Bill said to him, doesn't it make you so happy when the young people in your church look disappointed that no one in wheelchairs has come? Because the level of expectancy, the level of, this is the church of the impossible is so high that they just want the wheelchairs in there because they're so used to seeing people get out of them. Goliath actually isn't David's real enemy. It's Saul. It's Saul who knows the Father, but lost his call because he was so frightened of everyone around him. He negotiated, he traded his call away. Or he is a fearsome enemy because he knows the Father and he's holding on to all that God called him to. But God sees he just can't. And he's a bit like when Samuel tears his robe away and all he's left with is this sort of damp cloth, isn't he? That's Saul. For Saul, read Caiaphas in the New Testament, who knows the form of religion, but not the power. Or the Jews in Acts who stubbornly resist all that the apostles are doing, the miracles, the explosion of love and power they're seeing around them. They just stubbornly resist it right to the end. Or the church today, when we're hooked on religion, when we worship at the altar of competence and events and growth. There's a church I've heard of that's an amazing church. It's growing, it's very successful, but they feel the pressure of growth. Which is the opposite of where they should be. They should be focused on Jesus and just loving everything he's doing. And you know what? Do you know how fear presents itself in the church? It presents itself in busyness. Busyness is the greatest enemy of the church. It's Hilary of Tours described busyness as this blasphemous anxiety to do God's work for him. Eugene Peterson says that a busy pastor, for that read a busy church, is like an adulterous wife or husband, and it's like an embezzling banker, or it's like a crooked lawyer. It's not what you want to be described as. We don't want to be described as a busy church. Are we a church who just wants to get really active and we sort of busy because of our deep fears? Or are we a church who wants to do the impossible? What sort of church are we?